let's talk about Eudora Welty, A Curtain of Green. This is a short story collection, which is included in, for me, you can get it on its own, but I've got in the Library of America edition, which is stories, essays, and a memoir. It's not, though I think it is her complete set of short story collections, it's not all her short stories in this. It's not all her essays, it's selected essays, and it doesn't include, I think, her last book. It does include her memoir. It is paired by, for those interested, by a complete novels book as well, which I have in slipcase because I could get it for a quarter of the price of the newer dust-jacketed one. This has her 5 novels in it. These are really nice editions, by the way, just to say about LOA. They're pricey. I think they're $40/pounds, something like that. Certainly £40 is the standard over here, or just under that. And that's a lot of money if you're buying it new. But yeah, they are very nicely bound, very heavy. They have good, thin paper, but good quality paper. Feels very nice. So I reckon if you see some in the thrift store, charity shop, do pick them up. I think you'll enjoy them. Eudora Welty was though her family were not from the Deep South, she grew up in the Deep South. She grew up in Mississippi, and she lived there virtually her whole life. She went to New York for a year, pretty much, which is interesting. A weird thing in terms of going to New York at the time she did. It was 1930. It was on the edge of some of the Harlem Renaissance, and certainly I expect kind of that affected her. She's an interesting Southern author, very much in the Southern tradition of literature. I did a close reading of Robert Penn Warren's, a poem of his, Old Time Childhood in Kentucky. And you can see these different voices within the tradition. Maybe the most famous ones nowadays people will think of as, that you wouldn't think of her necessarily as Southern tradition, Harper Lee or William Faulkner or Flannery O'Connor. And Eudora Welty, the odd thing there is that she was the first living person to be inducted into the Library of America. Her book, she was still alive when these were published originally, and she is certainly, I think, was considered very important and special by a lot of people. And compared, though, to lots of more famous American authors and those Southern authors I mentioned, including probably Robert Penn Warren, her name is somewhat in eclipse. It's something you don't massively hear, and that's a shame. She has a real gift for writing, certainly, and A Curtain of Green is her first short story collection, and it is an interesting one when you compare it certainly with her slightly more mature writing. And think about her third collection of stories, for instance, Golden Apples, or her middle novels, Delta Wedding, Losing Battles. Losing Battles might have been, I think that was the last one she actually wrote. It wasn't the last one she published, but it was the last one she wrote, to be fair. But these middle to late novels, that there are signs of many of these stories being written by a woman who, the earliest of which, she's in her mid-20s when she writes something like Death of a Travelling Salesman. And they're published when she's 32. This is a young woman's collection. It's a debut collection, but it is exceptionally interesting. And as I say, a shame about her being an eclipse is that, and I think there are all kinds of reasons for that, but that she is incredibly communicative and very good at realising an area, a landscape, a place, as well as a situation. And the best of the stories here really do that. So, just to keep it otherwise brief, basically the biggest flaw, there are a couple of types of stories, I should say. Some stories she's good at observing the grotesque and the odd and the tragic, and sometimes it's odd or tragic in some low-key way, but we don't need to feel too depressed by it. It's just more a weird situation. In other cases, it's obviously more grotesque, so something like Flowers for Marjorie, or Clytie, or Why I Live at the P.O. These sort of kind of often dealing with madness, depression, strangeness. There's, in that sense, a Southern Gothic-y element, certainly, you could imagine seeing in there. but there's also some that are perhaps just a little bit more, even if they are they're not necessarily cheery. Very few of these stories are truly cheery. There are a couple which I think are quite redemptive, but there's some which are perhaps, and I think these are probably the better stories generally, are those which aren't simply capturing the tragic and the grotesque. They're kind of, wow, that's weird and odd and sad, but at some level have a deeper pathos, not simply a horror but a sympathy. And Death of a Travelling Salesman, A Worn Path, and maybe Keela the Outcast Indian Maiden, certainly The Hitchhikers as well, A Memory. Those are all good examples of that. And what I think sometimes accompanies it's the weakest stylistic tick in all these stories, but is more likely to accompany the grotesque, I think, certainly, is there's a certain kind of trying for effect, I think, sometimes, pushing, because Welty is affected and learning from 20th century technique. She's writing these, remember, as I say, in the 1930s, basically, and she is obviously influenced by that. She doesn't always give you all the information or the very ending. She explains in an interesting essay here about one of these. She talks about the most common question she gets is about the worn path, and she answers a question or tries to deal with a question there. Is because one thing is that she ends the story before the resolution of the thing that the story is kind of nominally the plot wise is about, because she's like, it doesn't matter, that's not really the point of the story. She does that, she's happy to break and let you infer things or work things out. Particularly, that's an obvious example. But also there is an issue of trying to revive metaphor, not go for T.S. Eliot's dead metaphors, as he calls them, but revive the metaphor, come with fresh things, and really try to offer something occasionally dissonant or jagged, but fresh and sharp. And I think, especially when combined with some of these sort of disturbing and strange visions and moments, there is, you can kind of get, sometimes I think it can be wearing. That's the big thing. It can be wearing. Let me find just an example of it. I think at her best, the style is much more understated. Basically, there is a much better sense of, what would be good is just to wash the reader in the environment. It's much more environmental writing. Here's just an example of something. She sat huddled in a long brown cotton petticoat, holding onto the string which went around the waist. Her mouse-coloured hair, pale at the temples, was hanging loose down to her shoulders like a child's unbound for a party. She held her knees against her numb, pendulant breasts and stared into the fire, her eyes widening. You can see there that there is... it's not actually the most jagged or dissonant example of language. There are moments, this kind of her hair being like a child's unbound for a party, or the condition of how she looks in her negligee. But it's just this kind of jarring, expressionistic, let's say, let's compare it to art, expressionistic moment. There are occasionally examples of over-forcing, of pushing too hard. But I think, generally speaking, she is a very good communicator. And you might have heard that and thought that's a very, very strong image, and it is. So I'm not criticising it. I'm actually saying sometimes it goes too far, but there's a real gift there. The state of exaltation was heightened or even brought about by the fact I was in love then for the first time. I had identified love at once. The truth is that never since has any passion I felt remained so hopelessly unexpressed within me, or appeared so grotesquely altered in the outward world. There is real eloquence and capture of feeling. I think, I would say the best stories, and stories which, if you're saying, I need to make a selected stories of Eudora Welty, you'd say, got to go for these. Death of a Travelling Salesman, Worn Path, they're both quite powerful and very human stories. They are maybe my favourite ones there. Powerhouse is great. Powerhouse is interesting. Both Powerhouse and A Worn Path take the perspective of a black person, and there's something where Welty was only occasionally political. She did write and her, I don't think her politics are categorizable by us in some cheap way. She did write a harrowing story in response to Medgar Evers' murder. But it's plain that she has an ear and a sympathy for every section, every class within the South. But that does include black people during segregation, under segregation. And there is a capture of the voice of travelling musicians in Powerhouse. There is the dignifying and bringing to life of an old poor black woman in a world that isn't necessarily particularly automatically respectful of her in A Worn Path. The Hitchhikers, I should say, is another very good story, and that one is just atmospheric. It's got almost a noir thing going on. It's very, very strong, I think, in terms of giving a sense of this place that this salesman, I think he is, has visited. Anyway, I enjoyed A Curtain of Green and other stories. I think it is not the most consistent bit of her work, but I think that if you just want to go and find one of those stories online, there might be some, Eudora Welty Foundation websites or whatever, which have samples. I would recommend it, and if you like them, go and read more. Till next time.